What's up, guys? This is Hardy from Digital Painting Studio, and today let's do something kind of different. Not really concept art, not really touching on art careers today. Let's just do a figure painting. One of my favorite things to do, but one of the most challenging things for an artist to do, painting people well. There are so many layers of complexity to this. It's part of what makes it a challenge. It's part of what makes it so rewarding when it all works. People are just complicated. They are complicated structurally with anatomy. There is all of the psychological baggage of reading someone's pose and attitude. So as I start painting in the values here, I've already got those two main big things set. I've got her anatomy described and her pose just with the line art. Those two things are really important. Anatomy just needs to be right. It's something that everybody is hardwired to notice, right? We all can tell if a person's arms are twice as long as they're supposed to be. Even subtle things like if her neck is too long, if her legs are too long, if her head is too big, your viewer will really notice that. And it can be this maddening thing because sometimes two people can just disagree with that. It seems like sometimes there is not an objective truth of what is correct anatomy. I've worked with artists on other projects where we were both on a team of character artists and we simply disagreed about what correct anatomy is. One artist would always have bigger heads, the other artist would always have longer legs. It just always seemed to be like we were at odds. And that helped me realize that there's some wiggle room in human interpretation of this. There's not really an objective right anatomy. Even when we trace a photo, so we are looking at a photograph of an actual real person. If we trace that, sometimes even that can look weird. Sometimes the lens can distort things, make heads look too big or legs look too long. So it can be a difficult thing to actually nail down what is right. Now, thank goodness, there are loads of great art resources on the internet and in books and with courses that can teach you some techniques for that. There are certain ways to measure things out, certain ways proportions need to add up. So I certainly don't want to make it seem like this is hopeless, but it's a challenge. And even when two people are looking at the same thing, they can see things differently. Now, the second thing that we need to do in a figure painting, once we have proportions and anatomy right, is start describing these forms three-dimensionally. I described the values with that orange airbrush color. And just so that everyone knows, I'm only using the standard Photoshop round brush here. There's really not much of a magic brush solution to good figure painting that I've found, as long as we have control. Value edges are hugely important when painting people or anything organic, really. We need to have both soft gradients and hard edges. So for example, this little area behind her ear, describing her jawline, there's this really abrupt change from light to dark. And that describes that change in plane, where we have two round forms of the jaw and the neck kind of butting up against each other. There's this sudden right angle change. And whenever that happens, we need that sudden shift from light to dark. We need it to cut from one to the other. That single principle is a game changer. Whenever I'm working with students in Concept Art Academy or with mentorship, that single change, that single light bulb happening is one of the biggest immediate levels up that I see constantly. So if you are trying something like this, just remember that value edge control is a key to instant leveling up. So with this woman, I don't want her musculature to look super defined. I want to just subtly imply it a little bit. I don't want every muscle and tendon to be popped out under tension as if I were painting the Incredible Hulk or something. So we can do this with some subtlety, and that edge control really helps. It's how we can see the implication of those muscles in her neck and the tendons on her wrist under her chin. They are barely there just because of some careful edge control. We see them, but they don't jump out and demand attention. In fact, that is sort of a bigger truth that I have come to realize about art in general. And it's something I was told years ago, but of course, like everything, it didn't become my own actual knowledge until I figured it out for myself. And that is, the more we can suggest, the more we can imply, leave things kind of not quite described fully, the better the end product ends up being. So what I mean by that is, we don't want to define everything to death. I don't want to paint every eyelash, every strand of hair, every tiny little detail. I want some of this to just remain messy brushstrokes. I want it to seem expressive and alive, like there's just some layered, textured brushwork going on, so that it looks real, but also expressive at the same time. When we can do that, when we can suggest and imply, when we can lead the viewer towards a conclusion rather than just outright telling them this is what this is, the end product ends up being so much better. It's like your viewer becomes involved. It's like you're inviting them in. And when that happens, they tend to like it more. It's like they take ownership of it. One of my favorite aha moments in art in the last few years is coming to that realization. And we can do that with figure painting too, maybe especially with figure painting. Even though there's all this technical stuff that has to be right, we still want these bigger art principles to apply too. We want things like value and color to work. We want that less is more expressive, unfinished approach to work in too. And now I'm starting to work in some textured brushes, just smudging things around, starting to try to make this feel painterly and alive. Make it look like we're actually smudging tone around on a canvas rather than it feeling like this highly computer-generated thing. Because that's another thing that I've found tends to make any digital painting received better, is the more it feels traditional, or at least the more it feels a little bit messy and textured and like it has sort of the hand of the artist built into it, the more people tend to like it. If it is this really cold and sterile, computer-generated looking thing, that can really give your viewer a negative impression. They sort of imagine it's this app spitting out an image rather than a craftsman at their desk actually making art. So that's what I always try to do is bring every digital painting back to this messier, textured place so that final effect really works. You'll notice as I'm going, I'm using Liquify a lot. Even after I have the sketch as perfect as I think I can possibly make it, I still see things along the way that seem like they need to be changed. Sometimes the nose can get a little too big, or an arm sort of gets painted too long. So that's the beauty of the digital medium, is all of these great editing tools. Nothing has to be set in stone. We can change and rework. It's infinitely forgiving. As I start painting in hair, that whole less is more approach, it's almost impressionism, that really takes over. Hair is something that I try to describe with as few brushstrokes as possible. Biggest less is more thing that there is. And it's something that a lot of beginners I think get a little bit wrong, is that hair becomes this really noisy thing where there are a million strands being shown. Every little 1 pixel brush mark showing another strand of hair. Even though that's what it looks like in reality, when I am looking at somebody's head of hair, that's what I see. I see thousands of little individual strands. But when painting, despite logic, it doesn't work when you try to paint it that way. It turns into this overly noisy digital garbage if you try and paint those individual strands. So that's a good rule of thumb with things like hair or eyelashes or teeth. If we can clump things together, turn it into this cloudy area of tone rather than individual units, it ends up reading way better. And just with this simple black shape, really, I already have this very clear impression of the shape of her hair, how her hairline works, how we kind of feather from hair into skin. That all really works just with that shape. I'll do a little bit of painting just to add some highlight, but especially with a dark-haired person, it's really easy, and I think it's the right decision to leave it pretty fuzzy in that way. Leave it as a shape. One of those great art truisms, again, something that I heard years ago, but it did not become my knowledge until I figured it out for myself, is that shape is kind of everything. It's the most fundamental unit of visual design. It's what we instantly register when we look at something. Before color, before any kind of story context, our eyes see a shape. And that's where we start. What is this thing? So if we can get shape right, everything else has a good foundation to start from. And that's very true with just starting a head of hair. Before you get into every unit, every little strand of hair hanging over her forehead or on her neck, we need that shape to be right. And we need to give it the impression that we want. Hair also opens up this whole other set of challenges, because once we start adding hair and eventually clothing, we get into this whole other universe of human complexity, which is style. Just by how this woman wears her hair, what clothes she chooses, does she have tattoos or piercings? Things like that start to really tell you a lot about her personality, her culture, what's important to her, what is she trying to put out there as her identity to the world. So it's this really fun set of decisions that we get to make as concept artists, as designers, is to actually answer these questions. This person who I am creating does not exist. This is not a real person. So I get to decide everything. I made a hairstyle that I thought kind of matched the personality that I have in mind. Actually, I think I'm going to have her in sort of a formal dress. Maybe we're catching her in this moment before she goes to a formal event of some kind, just kind of hanging out in her room or apartment, looking out a window, waiting for the hour to arrive or something like that. You can invent little stories to make this all seem more like a fully formed character and universe that we're imagining here. And all of those style decisions really resonate with the viewer. Again, it all comes back to that human connection, the way that everybody can relate to an image of a person. It can come from a memory. There's a chance I might be painting somebody who looks like someone you know. So it can kind of call up these memories, make these associations for your viewer. It can, it can be an attractive person. It can stir that kind of a reaction. It can look like somebody who was mean to you in high school. All kinds of layers of complexity can just work in. And it's really awesome. It's all part of the power that we wield when we are painting figures, when we are creating people as designers and concept artists. And in this case, just as a figure painter. None of those story things, none of the style or personality, None of it will really work if those base elements like proportions and anatomy, if those are wrong, if her head is twice the size it's supposed to be, or if her hands are baby hands, nobody will get that far. It will be dismissed immediately. So that again comes back to the great challenge and the great reward of designing characters, is that it is both very difficult and very rewarding. We have to get these base elements right so that the cooler, higher level stuff doesn't get lost. Highlighting this hair a little bit, just adding tiny little tinges of color to give it the implication of complexity without actually painting many individual hairs. Again, the fewest marks I can make, the better. The less description I can do of hair, the less noisy it can be, and the more it will just kind of be as a simple shape and get the job done with those base elements of design rather than getting into exhaustive detail, the more successful it is, the less of a distraction it becomes. And I just love that. It's kind of this nice challenge of trying to walk that line between making something just a chunky brushstroke, something expressive that looks like it was whipped out of a brush, but also make it look realistic. Walking that line, I think that's something that great artists, all of my favorite current concept artists and digital painters, that is that quality that I admire most, is an artist who can do both, who can make it look expressive, like brushstrokes, like textured paint daubed on a canvas, but also have it look real, have that impression really fit, have it work, have you look at this finished painting and accept that as a real person, not just a computer-generated thing, not even just a collection of paint on a canvas, but as a person, as somebody with a story, with a life, with an attitude, with style. All of those things we try to do at the same time. That's the really cool challenge. I'm starting to get into some pretty high levels of detail here. I'm planning ahead a little bit and not rendering in the areas where her dress will be covering. So we really want certain areas to be highly detailed on the skin, but I'm letting a lot of it just fade into nothing. The most important part of any character or figure painting easily is the face. It is what we all relate to. I have this rule of thumb where I try to devote 50% of the total design and rendering time of a character to the face, fully half of everything. So every bit of clothing, the hands, the feet, the whole body, all of that only gets half compared to the face. That's just because that is the most important part. It's what your viewer will immediately relate to. And again, it's one of those things we as people are just programmed for. We look at a person's face the second we encounter them. It's how we know where they're coming from. How does this person feel towards me? We instantly size up our fellow people in this way. So as artists, we can use that. We can use those facial expressions and proportions to tell our viewer volumes in an instant. Somebody will look at this person, specifically their face, and make an opinion about them within probably less than a second. They just get it. It's something our brains do instantaneously. We're really good at that. And that's something we can use. It's really powerful. So definitely faces deserve most of your rendering time. Now, second to that, the second most expressive part of the body is the hands. They can gesture, they can grip, they can show tension. There's a lot of personality and humanness that gets communicated with hands. So just these casual poses I went for here, we've got, of course, one hand supporting her chin. supporting that overall slouching, relaxed, casual posture. And then the other one is just sort of hanging off the end. I'm going to add in a chair later. The pose probably doesn't make a ton of sense yet, but she's sitting kind of sideways on a chair with her elbow resting on the backrest. And that other hand is just sort of hanging out. It's in this casual, semi-grip pose. And that all fits. It's sort of like the slouch. If I had her hand in a fist, it would tell a completely different story. If I had her hand pointing, totally different. So there is so much power and information in hands, second only to the face, the most important part of the body to get right. And also a weirdly complex set of anatomy in and of itself. Every finger, every crease, they all have to be right. We're finally moving into the more drapery parts of this, adding some clothing, gonna add the chair, gonna sort of make this more of a finished scene. But our figure painting is largely done. So this is always the part of a painting like this when I can start to breathe a sigh of relief. It's sort of mostly just presentation and composition and just framing things in the right way moving forward. And it's really cool too. Drapery studies can be this really nice, artful way to frame something like this. We've done all of this nice, realistic rendering on her skin, and the drapery just kind of gives it some contrast. It's like we have a different material to counteract against the skin. Always nice to have little bits of contrast, one of those core design principles that we want every painting to have. Just like with the hair, I'm starting simply with shape. I want this dress to fit right. I want it to have the right lines to seem like the kind of dress that I want. I cannot complain to be any kind of a fashion expert, but like with any other kind of concept art, it comes from what you can observe, what you can research, what kind of visual library you can make in your own mind of a dress that you saw somewhere on TV, in a movie, at a wedding, some kind of a color or texture. So I'm thinking of something that's sort of a silky texture. I want it to have a little bit of a shine to it, but at the same time, I don't want this texture to take over. I still want the skin, the face, the human part of this painting to do all of the heavy lifting. And I think that's what we're doing here. It's a good reason to keep it dark and simple. I just want this to seem like simple drapery, implying the shape of her figure, but not over describing it in any way. I'm making some progress on this chair too. Weirdly, this becomes a difficult thing where we have to get the pose to add up to this chair. So this might have been one of those places where I should have planned things out a little bit better. I had a general idea of the pose, but I think it's working. Strangely, the chair has to have some personality too. It has to fit the situation. I want it to generally have the same character as her dress, to seem like something kind of formal. Don't want it to seem like some cafeteria chair or something out of a school gym or anything. Want it to seem like an antique, have that same elegance and story as the rest of the painting does. So it weirdly all has to fit. And this comes back to the same thing. I am no more a furniture expert than I am a fashion expert, but I am always collecting visuals. That's a concept artist's job, is to just constantly be observing and filing away little things like this. And when you have a vague idea, you can always go research. Go look up, go Google antique chair, go Google wedding dress, and you'll instantly be flooded with more cool options than you could imagine. And then it's our job to kind of assemble the pieces and turn it into something cohesive and beautiful. And that's what we're trying to do here. Make this all fit. Make the character and the environment have a story, have a personality, make it all work together. I've got this custom shape that I made a few years ago that is perfect for this. It was actually this ornate piece of metalwork, but it looks like this nice kind of fancy backing to a chair, especially if I erase away and make it just a strip. Perfect. It's detailed, but it's not taking over. We're sort of implying a lot of detail without actually showing it. Again, coming back to that painting axiom that just seems to work in every situation. And I can just warp that into place, and I think we've got a pretty effective chair with just a little bit of fine tuning. Just like the skin, just like the dress, I want this to be detailed enough for it to look real and believable, but only up to that point. I don't want to over detail. I don't want to zoom in and start rendering every grain of wood on this chair. I don't want the cushion to have a million little details going on. I want it to just give the impression, and then I want it to just fade into being brush strokes. That's it. Lead your viewer up to that point, and then let it just turn into this alive, expressive artfulness. It works in just about every situation. One of my favorite painting truisms in recent years. Getting into final detail. How do I want to polish this? What little eye-catching bits of detail do I actually want to include now that I've made so much of it expressive and loose and painterly? What's that thing that I want my viewer to come away from with this? That memorable hook that kind of makes this all work. So little bits of personality are what I'm going to use here. I really want to define this person very concretely. I want her to have a lot of personality. That's the thing that I want my viewer to take away. So little bits of extra culture and personality really do a great job of that. I've added some jewelry hanging from her wrists. I've given her some earrings. We will add a tattoo as well. Little things like that communicate volumes. It's like putting war paint on a warrior character, or any kinds of little punch-up details we can add to a character design. It just gives you so much personality, so much backstory. It makes your painting very human. And that's what your viewer will really relate to. I'm using a photo of this awesome tapestry at my mom's house for a great tattoo. I'm just going to put it on her leg. I don't want it to take over. I want it to be something that the viewer has to go looking for a little bit. Not anything that really smacks you on the forehead, but is one of those little secondary details. And as a final bit of polish, or almost final, edge lights. Maybe my favorite part in any painting, and watch as this absolutely comes to life in the next few minutes. If we just add this secondary light source to the perimeter of the character, to her face, her hands, her shoulders, it does all of these things to bring this to life. It makes it seem like she's suddenly much more in her environment. Now I'm getting that feeling that she's sitting at a window. The sun is on her face. She's looking out into the daylight, kind of thinking about something. It also helps to define her shape three-dimensionally. It really rounds out those edges. But most of all, it just adds drama. It looks like something in a photography studio. It looks very cinematic, like we have this really bright secondary light to make little bits of hair glow, her skin glow, to just really bring the character to life. It can be a really cool thing to do, to render things just a touch to the darker side, to set yourself up for these really bright pops of highlights. And then we can get into all kinds of things like making that edge light bloom a little bit, like there's some lens flare effect, so that she's actually sitting in this ray of light cast by this window that she's in front of. So there we have it. This is finished. I hope you enjoyed this half an hour of me nerding out on this topic that I love, something that really takes a lifetime of development. But it's super fun, super worthwhile, and it's one of those core skills that every artist should really devote some time to. I'll see you guys next week, but in the meantime, good luck with your artwork. Paint something cool today.